Hello and welcome to K-Pod, the podcast about Korean Americans and arts and culture from Korean American Story. I'm Catherine Hong, a writer and editor.
And I'm Juliana Sohn, a photographer.
Today we are thrilled to be interviewing author Marie Myung-Ok Lee, who has written the acclaimed new novel, The Evening Hero. It's a sweeping, darkly comic story centered on an aging Korean American physician living in northern Minnesota named Myung-Man Kwak. In the twilight of his life, Kwak finds himself forced to question his past, his conception of himself, and his pursuit of the American dream. Lee, whose apartment on the Upper West Side we're recording from today, was born in Minnesota in a small town like the one in her novel. Her father was an anesthesiologist who was a pioneer of open-heart surgery. They were the only Asians in the entire community, and Lee was expected to go to Harvard and become a doctor. Instead, Lee attended Brown and went on to become a prolific fiction writer and essayist. She has written 6 previous books, including Finding My Voice, which was published in 1992 and was the first contemporary YA novel to feature an Asian American protagonist. Over her career, Lee has championed the work of dozens of other Asian American writers through the Asian American Writers Workshop, which she co-founded 31 years ago. When she's not writing, she's teaching at Columbia and caring for her son, Jason, who has autism and who has recently become famous in his own right, as we'll hear later. We have much to talk about, Marie. Thank you so much for having us.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
We thought we'd kick this off by asking you to read from The Evening Hero.
Great. I'd love to. I'm just going to give you a little teaser from the prologue. His name was Myung-Man. The components of his name were, as custom dictated, selected by his paternal grandfather, just as his father's had been selected by his grandfather, and so forth, back to the origins of the clan. The grounding character Young, hero, cemented him to all his cousins, Young-jo, Young-ho, Young-chun, Young-bok, in the 12th generation of Kwaks, whether he knew them or not. Man meant evening. Evening Hero would thus be carved into all the family trees on the male Kwak headstones, henceforth chipped into his jade namestick, his legal signature. Young-man's place as first son was evident in contrast to his younger brother, Young-shik, vegetable hero. To his patients, he was no evening hero, but Dr. Kwak, a little Asian man, certainly short of stature at 5'4", the hospital's obstetrician. He was distinctive to the white townspeople, not just by being Asian, but by being the first doctor from somewhere, anywhere else. First, North Korea, then South Korea. In America, a year first in Birmingham, Alabama, repeating his internship as all foreign-trained physicians had to do. And though he was a graduate of the Harvard of Korea, no hospital even bothered to reply to the American job search of this man from Asia, a region of the world America had decided it didn't want and made laws to ban and expel. Young-man would end up so desperate for employment that he would drive straight north with his wife and infant child to this Arctic circle of the U.S., the Iron Range of Minnesota, where the winters were almost lightless, where schools closed for blizzards only when temperatures fell below minus 50 degrees.
Thank you.
It's been 18 years in the writing and the publishing, so I'm kind of almost in shock that it's actually finally a book that I can touch.
Juliana and I both read Finding My Voice as well as The Evening Hero. We read them back to back. And one thing we were so struck by, it's pretty obvious to anyone, is the setting, which is a small town, not unlike where you grew up, which is Hibbing, correct?
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about growing up in Hibbing and also sort of why you keep coming back to this setting, which is like your Dublin, if you're Joyce, or your
Faulkner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or your Ann Tyler's Baltimore. You know?
Exactly. It's a terrain that I know super well. And obviously, when I was growing up, when you're growing up, you just know what you know is normal. But then now I've spent the bulk of my life in New York, and looking back on it, it's always really interesting because the two books seem superficially almost like they're both autobiographical, because in both of them, there's, the small town, there's the range, there's the doctor father, there's like sort of the tiger parenting and so forth. But what's really interesting with the two of them is Finding My Voice was my first novel. And as James Baldwin said, almost all first novels are autobiographical. The author has so much to get off their chest. So for me, growing up in an all-white area, I felt like I want to write something that's universal. So I'm going to write like this all-white character book. And I started when I was in college. I was like, what period of my life do I know a lot about? Oh, my teenage years. So I'm going to write a book about high school and how fun it was. And then it was actually my boyfriend, who's not my husband, said, how come there are no Korean characters in this? And I just thought, well, I want it to be, universal, like Flannery O'Connor and stuff. But then sort of with his encouragement, I made Ellen the protagonist Korean.
I would assume that you started with Ellen as the protagonist.
So then when Ellen, the Korean protagonist, then there's all this racism and all this other stuff that really surprised me. No, I wrote a whole draft of fun in high school. It was called Greetings from Arkin, Minnesota. It was like completely different. Completely different.
Because I think I heard another interview where you talked about high school days, and you mentioned that you had a good time in high school. You were a head cheerleader, is that right?
Yes.
So then I'm trying to square it with what you're in recollection now, maybe more than you realized then. You were experiencing all kinds of racism, maybe.
Yes.
It wasn't as overt.
Ellen, in Finding My Voice, experiences racism, but it's so in these like flashes where sometimes she can't even like, did I hear that correctly? Did that just happen? So they're almost like these very almost subtleties, and so this must have peppered your existence as well while you were head cheerleader.
Oh, definitely. And I still feel like it comes into relief now with the model minority, because a lot of times when we as Asian Americans experience crime, we are always like, did that really happen? And so that is kind of a theme with all my books, because I kind of feel like, just sort of like being a contemporary fiction writer, I almost feel like we have to almost acknowledge 2016. And then one of the things that some librarians have brought up is that, how come all your books have like some kind of like really violent like pivot in them? And in fact, my newest book that's coming out is a retelling of Mice and Men, and it kind of have to really lean into the violence, because that of Mice and Men is really violent. But I'm also realizing this isn't an advertent thing that I'm doing, but it also is reflecting, I experienced a lot of physical violence when I was growing up. But to look at me, no one would think, oh, like you were a cheerleader, like nobody really thinks of my first memory of growing up as being punched in the face when I'm like 3 or 4. Like I have this memory of someone calling me chink and punching me in the face.
Do you mean an adult?
Yeah, well, like a teenager. Someone who's bigger. So I remember him punching me in the face. That's like one of my like early memories. And it was kind of also when you live in a town that's all white, it's kind of like all of like people's like racist inclinations doesn't have anywhere to focus except like on our family. So that book was like super autobiographical. It's also about a teenager having an experience, but it was so informed by what happened to me and what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about racism. I wanted to talk about what it felt like, to be a victim of violence. But this book is so different in that I wanted to write a book about someone who's like my father, who's a very small person, that everyone has assumptions about what they're like. And I remember my father being very patriotic and always going like, there's no racism, like I've never experienced racism. But then seeing him like how he was treated like at the Northwest counter, exactly what you're talking about, like this sort of untraceable racism, I could tell he felt that and he would get really angry, but he wouldn't call it that. So in some ways, this book is more my imagining what someone like my father, and I'm almost like trying, my father passed away like more than 20 years ago. So in a weird way too, this is my way like writing my way back. Like Myung-Ok is actually 10 years younger. He was a child during the Korean War. The first one's more autobiographical. This is more like I'm trying through fiction to try to do justice to that kind of generation. And I also feel kind of almost scared because it's sort of, here in America, we call the Korean War the Forgotten War. But in Korea, it's kind of becoming forgotten too, where I kind of feel like whenever there's something with North Korea, the young people are like, let's reunite. But then the older people are like, no, that was like this in the war. And it's kind of like, well, shut up. Like that war was a long time ago. But that doesn't matter. It still happened. And it still reverberates. Like the trauma reverberates like through Korea, like to like our generation. And I feel like unless we remember it, it's just going to kind of go away. Like the new generation will just be replaced not even remembering it.
So, speaking of your father, from what I heard, he had spoke fluent English, which he learned when he was in Korea, right? I mean, he
Yes.
was quite unusual, kind of a pioneer in many ways because he came so early on. Will you just tell us a little bit about
Sure.
your dad?
Well, when my father passed away, so again, I don't know much about him, but he did leave me his diaries. And from 1946 on, he only wrote his diaries in English because
Wow.
he just wanted to practice English, which is great for me because my Korean's not very good. So he wrote it all in English, and he just had some very interesting idea that someday he was going to go to the U.S., which, at the time would have been like, I'm going to go to the moon someday, because of the laws. There was no immigration. He's in Korea.
Wait, do you know how he learned English at the time?
Some of it was self-taught. He does mention when he was in school, they did have like a woman who came in and taught them English. And then during the Korean War, he joined this like American Bible study.
Yeah.
So he was a liaison officer for the army. And so they gave like these free lessons. And so what happened too that made it extra lucky is he practiced a lot of spoken English. So when the 8th Army came to Seoul National University and they needed liaison officers, they took the top 5 people from his class, just like whoops. But my dad was the only one who could speak pretty well.
Right. And in your novel, that's sort of the key to Jungmann's success or rise is his,
Exactly.
his English.
It's like that you never know what the opportunity is going to be,
to-
but exactly. And it's just because Jungmann is like singing these hymns and stuff, but it ends
Right.
like, and he hates being a Christian, but somehow the hymns get him to the U.S.
So how did your dad end up in Minnesota, of all places?
Well, like Jungmann, so because he's foreign trained, he had to go get his internship done again. And that was it was in Birmingham, Alabama. And it was also during Jim Crow. So you can kind of imagine my parents are coming from the world's most homogenous country to Jim Crow, Alabama. And they're saying, wow, this is what race relationships are like in America. This is horrible. And that's one of the reasons like they never taught us Korean. They really felt like to give us the best opportunity, we had to become as American as possible,
Right.
as white as possible. The Army helped him get his visa, but because of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1924, all immigration was banned from East Asia, so they could not do anything after his visa ran out. And then in northern Minnesota, they were so desperate, they had been looking for an anesthesiologist for years because what native-born American wants to live where it's 50 below and you're the only person in this whole region who does anesthesia? So you're on call like 24/7. Like even, for instance, for the most important thing in my father's life, my brother's Harvard graduation, he had to hire some guy to come in from this other city to take over and he had to pay him. But you can imagine so you're getting paid less, you're on call all the time. But it was kind of this mutual, they would take someone who had immigration problems. They were that desperate. And then for my father, when he went there, he goes from Birmingham where it's all hot and that Jim Crow to northern Minnesota where everyone is blonde and blue-eyed, which is kind of like exactly what he thought America would look like. So in a weird way, he just thought this was going to be a really wonderful place. I guess he felt like if we just worked hard enough, we would be super accepted.
Right.
And that wasn't quite
And
what happened.
my guess is it was very working class where you grew up. Were you were probably wealthier than
Yes.
the average person. Your father had this very important position in town. At the same time,
Right.
you were maybe an outcast. It was an
Right.
interesting dynamic.
There was definitely like a class issue. And exactly, having gone to an Ivy League school was interesting because, in a town like that, it's not like money does not make you like better, like sort of the way we do it here. It's all like, who's the big hockey player or who's this? It was a very different thing and in fact, probably only 40% of people went to college. Almost no one went to like a 4-year college. And in fact, one of the other doctor's kids went to Yale. And when he came back to work in the mines over the summer, they said, where'd you go to school? And he goes, Yale. And he goes, oh, that sounds like an out-of-state school. Is it an out-of-state school? Like that, what I'm saying? Like for my parents, they're just like, it's Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. Like were so not impressed by Brown. But like none of my friends, like I was just in Minneapolis for my launch tour and my friends drove 4 hours to come see me and none of them went to college because none of my friends went to college.
And what are your siblings? Where did they end up and what are they doing?
My eldest brother went to Harvard, and then my next brother went to Carleton, and I went to Brown, and then my sister went to Harvard. So
4 kids.
Yeah. and it's various. Everyone's kind of self-employed. My sister used to teach at Biola, which is the Bible Institute of LA, and she's kind of retired. And one of my brothers does PR. My other brother's
Nobody
kind of
lives
retired.
in Minnesota. All the siblings left the state.
Actually, my Carleton brother, for whom
right.
my parents were the roughest on because he did not get into Harvard. He took a lot of the brunt for me before I also didn't get into Harvard. He's still there and he's the dutiful son. My mother has dementia, but a lot of because his devotion, we are still able to keep her at home.
You mentioned that your parents were super assimilated and they made sure that their kids were super assimilated as sort of a survival mechanism here in the States. And so you grew up without learning Korean. Did you also grow up without a lot of Korean traditions and culture?
Oh, definitely. My parents didn't talk about it at all. But, when I was a little kid, I wanted to learn Korean so bad. So I would eavesdrop on them. But, I would only hear weird fragments of stuff. So I'd say what does Maria mean? When you say Maria, like refers to something, they would just be like, ugh, don't even whatever. Because you know what I mean? I'd only hear little fragments. So the only things I ever learned was Pyongwan, because my dad would talk about go to the hospital, dong, ojum, and then a bunch of weird Japanese words because my parents grew up in the colonization. So I'd be so when I went to Korea as a Fulbright scholar to learn Korean and also to research my novel, but also then I'm saying for underwear, salimata, all these weird Japanese words. So it's the 10 words that I know, 5 don't even count. And of all my siblings, nobody eats Korean food or anything. It's sort of that's how we were raised. And I feel if I would have continued on that path, I would also feel that way. Do you know what I'm saying? The first time, I had Mexican food, I was like, oh my God, this is so spicy. I hate it. Because in the Midwest, it's oh no, too much cinnamon. It's too spicy. Everything's super bland. But then it wasn't. And actually, I was talking about this with Kathy Park Hong, and I said, I just feel this stuff goes right into my veins. And she said the same thing. And I just feel I finally reached this equilibrium where normally, I'd be oh, it smells bad or it's really salty. Part of it is we didn't have a Korean grocery.
Yeah.
And then we when we finally did, we would drive 4 hours to Minneapolis once a year to see the one other Korean family. And then one time the kimchi jar broke on the way. My parents and it broke, and we were in a car for 4 hours with kimchi smell, and they also did not allow us to eat it. My mom didn't like my dad eating it because there's this fear of the smell. And then they had to put it way in the back. Also, there's so much emotional because I just be is that a bomb? What's wrong with it? That we're not even supposed to touch it. So I just kind of grew up with this real fear of it. And my sister today, I can see she's just kind of I don't want to eat that. But I'm no, actually, if you start eating it, you won't be able to stop. But she won't. You know what I mean? She won't take that plunge.
So I heard that you didn't even know what your Korean name was.
Exactly. No, I did not. So for finding my voice, I'm this girl needs a Korean name. I don't know anything about anything. So I'm asking my parents, what's my Korean name? And they're it's Myung-Ok. So I'm put that. And Ellen's last name is Sung. And a bunch of my friends are why'd you name her Sung? That's such a weird Korean name. And I was that was the one Korean family that we drove the 4 hours. So this was the very small universe in which I understood anything Korean. Basically, taking your shoes off in the house was the only Korean thing we did. And I didn't think of it as being Korean. I thought of it as being smart. But I've also realized after spending, so much time in Korea, because, in Korea, my relatives would call me Mori, and I don't like that homonym, Mori. And, my husband's name is Carl, so it'd be Mori Carl. And they would just laugh about haircut. Do you know what I'm saying? I got kind of sick of that. So I just like being called Myung-Ok better. And so I'm just kind of happy.
Now it's become part of your identity.
Oh, definitely.
So much, right?
And the weird thing too is that it's not on my passport. And then finally, my mom's trying to arrange things, and I finally got my birth certificate. It's literally my second name. It's on my birth certificate. So I just finding it so funny. My parents never told me what my name is. My sister's nickname is Gi, and I'm realizing it's because her name is Chung-Ok. And when we were little, before we were in consciousness, they must have called her Chung-Ok. And so that's why because everyone's why are you calling her Gi? That's such a weird nickname. But that must have been when I was listening in. It's just these really bizarre fragments.
I find that so fascinating because my parents only spoke Korean at home and we only ate Korean food at home. And I think my dad has almost never, ever called me anything other than my Korean name. So it just fascinates me that people grew up in such polar opposite ways.
Right. But did your parents grow up in a situation because, they were undocumented, they had no expectations of ever going back to Korea? And then my dad was such a tiger dad because he didn't have any other examples. He was convinced, you know what I mean? Like if we became bilingual, we'd get confused and get accent and that would hurt our chances to go to Harvard. Where now, like for my Fulbright, I had to take Korean class at Yale and half the kids were just getting out of their language requirement, like they could speak it at home. And I was realizing, wow, wouldn't that be interesting to grow up where it's like totally okay to like speak it at home?
So you must have been incredibly curious about your Korean heritage and identity because you worked so hard to cultivate this community for yourself. And you said finding your cohorts with the Asian American Writers Workshop, being the first Korean American Fulbright scholar to Korea. I mean, it feels like you were denied that at home. And as an adult, you really made an effort to find the food, find the community. And all your books are centered around this Korean American experience.
I think it actually might be the books are coming first. There's a quote from Wittgenstein: in order to be like an artist, you have to really know yourself, or all the art you will produce will be a form of deceit. So I think part of that was knowing when, I took one creative writing course when I was at Brown, and then, writing that teen novel, there had always been something that felt wrong about it. Not wrong necessarily, but it was technically really good, but there's something like missing. And so I think once I got over that idea of like what I needed, or just like the reason this book took so long is it told me I need to go to North Korea to see what this is all about. And similarly, to write whatever I have written these last years, I have needed to know all of this. It has been this weird drive, and a lot of it was super embarrassing because my mom, once I started taking Korean, would actually make fun of me. Like she'd say, "You sound exactly like those missionaries." And I'd try not to be like, "Thanks a lot, Mom." You know what I mean? Because that could have been just such a gift. So yeah.
So how is your Korean now?
It's terrible. It's terrible,
but you can get around. When you go to Korea, you can.
It's more like, my hearing is really bad. So even like someone saying you versus me, you know what I mean? Like I can't hear, but like I've written things, about, I don't know, like Squid Game and things that have to do with language. And I'm realizing, and my cousin's family has noticed this, like because I work with language, I really understand like a lot of the nuances, but then I can't speak to save my life. I can't speak well. I can't hear well. I just watch a lot of K-dramas.
I love the parts in your book where you analyze or even just drop in these subtle explanations of Korean language or English and how different it is.
Like a pronouns.
Yeah, I love this part. Just things like this, because I'm always talking to my mom about what we're missing when we're talking to her and how she feels like she often can't express things, where I misinterpret things. But I love this part. English was so strange the way the subject, not the action of the verb, came first. How he, she, I, and they were so necessary. While in Korean, you knew who was speaking or being spoken of just from the verb. Americans also habitually said I a lot, which seemed very conceited. Observations like this, were these things that you've thought about for years, or was it research and talking to linguists or other Korean speakers?
Honestly, really, I think it has been more, I've spent 18 years with Youngman, and it's just more knowing what he knows. And so no, it hasn't really been as much about analyzing language. It's just more understanding him. It's more like when I was writing it, I actually would laugh at stuff because I thought he was being really funny. It sounds weird, like being schizophrenic, but it is like when the character really takes off, they just do their own thing. The good thing is that I have had the structure of the language and I understand it. Like it's more like I understand what he's talking about, but it's not like I've done any like I'm any kind of linguist or anything.
I find it surprising that you're not as fluent as maybe I expected from reading the conversation of the fancy doctor friends of at that party when like the way they speak, I could hear even though it was written in English, I could hear how they would have said it in Korean.
I really appreciate that. I had so many fights with my editors over that. They would just be like, well, do it more like this. And and it's not enough to say, well, they're kind of speaking like non-standard English. It wasn't even that. It was just like, no, it sounds wrong. I'm like, no, it's perfect. Just like from the audiobook, the guy, I heard him read, and he read Young-man's voice in a slightly off accent when he said Korean words. I was like, perfect. Because Young-man's also been away from Korea for 40 years. So it's those kind of like subtleties. I really appreciate that. As a person of color, like a writer of color, I feel like fighting for that is so important, where versus, no, it should be written like this because we're all white and this is how we're used to reading. Readability becomes such a big issue. Like, well, white people want to read this. And I'm kind of like, I don't care. This is how they probably would talk, or this is how I hear them talking in my head.
So on a side note that is totally tangential, when people read audiobooks, writers of color, and specifically Koreans, they really need a language coach. If not, the actor reading it should be familiar with the language, because I've listened to so many Korean books that the Korean pronunciation is so off that it's
right.
It catches my ear, and it's almost like, ooh, it makes me cringe every time I hear it. And I think one of the worst offenders was for ajashi, it was ajiyoshi.
Right. It probably just takes you right out of the narrative.
Yes.
But it's important because also I asked for a Korean American narrator, and that person, Raymond Lee, was the first person they auditioned. And I just said, no, that's it. Like, no need to go any further. And for the cover, I asked for a Korean, either someone who's Korean or a diaspora Korean, even though it's not necessarily like there's going to be like a temple on it or something. But you can see that even in the subtler aspects, it's deeply Korean, like the colorways and so forth. And I noticed that first actually because my editor at the New York Times, where I was writing a lot of op-eds, is Chinese American. And he did that for me first. He only had either Korean or diaspora Korean illustrators. Like these things all like matter.
I'm glad you mentioned your op-ed writing, because one thing I really enjoy about your writing and all your social media is that you do not hold back, and you express outrage in a great way that's very cathartic for, I guess, people who share your opinions. So whether it's Trump or racism or the Supreme Court or whatever's going on in the news or in your life, with unleashed dogs, like you express your outrage and you're funny about it. And you clearly aren't afraid to say what, maybe some people don't want to hear. But then I was thinking about your protagonist in Finding My Voice, how when she was a, younger girl, she was a people pleaser, right? She didn't want to create waves, and she had to learn to express herself and to fight back. Did you go through that evolution yourself?
I was probably the most opinionated kid in the family of the four, and definitely the most trouble to my parents. But in terms of the people pleasing, I was much more of a people pleaser than Ellen, my protagonist. So she was almost more like my ideal what if I stood up for myself more, or had like this big breakthrough, like with my parents and racism at the same time. No, that was much more of a fantasy thing. I think as I've gotten older, though, I feel more imperative, particularly like this book is a lot of imperatives from the 2016 election, particularly like Trump calling for a genocide of North Koreans, like all the bombing. And similarly, my social media and like this book are similar because, with all the research I've done, it really seems that the Korean War has been one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. We've had a lot of wars. And when the research I've done almost makes me feel like I should be using the word genocide in terms of what happened, the amount of people who were killed, and the property damage that was done. Like North Korea was bombed, like 99% of its infrastructure was bombed. Like why would you do that to any other? It was like done by like a third country. So to some degree, what I wanted to do was not write some kind of trauma epic, but I wanted to write a really funny book about genocide. So I think similarly, I used social media as a kind of brain dump for myself, but at the same time, John Waters has talked a lot about humor being a weapon. So I feel like I'm not just being like, I'm so mad about Roe. If I'll just point out more about how the justices are such jerks or something in a funny way. And then I feel like hopefully that would help people sort of reframe things and maybe see things in a different way, in a way that may foment action. Because, while, I do go to marches and I'm involved in a lot of social justice things, I do feel like I have more impact as a writer. And I consider my social media presence to be writing too. It's 140 characters. It's writing.
I try to educate myself on a lot of Korean history. It's really dull reading, history books and textbooks. And I think some of the information goes in and just leaves. And I find myself reading fiction by authors like you that write about Korean history. You've done a ton of research. And because the stories are attached to these compelling characters, I'm actually learning a lot and being educated about history that I had no idea about. And I know that you believe that fiction can educate. So you clearly do it with intention.
Oh, definitely. And for this book in particular, I also felt like I wanted to decenter the history of Korea and the Korean War away from actually the textbooks, because we already have textbooks and a lot of them are written by like white people. I actually, for almost every detail has been verified, but they've been verified via talking to survivors. And in some ways too, because my parents won't talk about it, I think just my own therapeutic thing, it was great for me to talk to other people, and probably they didn't want to talk to their kids about it either, but they would talk to me. I think of this is kind of like this love letter to like this history that's been lost to my parents. And really just to like an anger thing about all this time, like when I was growing up, it was always like I was either a chink or a Jap. Like no one even knew about Korea.
There wasn't even a good slur.
Right. There wasn't even a slur. People didn't really think of Korea as, and they kind of still don't. And I think the fear that I have, as a Korean is I feel like, well, we've just gone from like forgetting, it's like chink Jap, and then we've gone to like Squid Game. And then just the idea that watching people consume Squid Game and be like, oh, it's so brutal, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you don't understand. This is an allegory of like U.S. occupation. So that just kind of like I feel like this is some kind of like reparations and revision that we need to do, like our generation. And one of the craziest things that I found among my father's diaries is that he had these little snippets of what he called short stories. And they were really cute. They were just like, Dr. Halper, hello, Dr. Lee. Hello, how are you? I am fine. End of story. And he clearly had wanted to be a writer at some point, but he never, ever, ever mentioned that. This entire time when my parents are both yelling at me, you cannot become a writer.
Yeah, what
cannot
did they
become
think
a writer.
about you
Cannot become a writer. Cannot become a writer. No. I had my first piece published in 17 magazine when I was in high school. My parents were like, oh, this
What
is
was
nice.
it about?
It was about being a volunteer worker. It was called, the original title was called Volunteer Workers Are Not Schmucks. And I did not realize, because I was reading Mad Magazine, I didn't realize schmuck was a bad word. I was just like reading all this Mad Magazine that had all these Yiddishisms. So the editor changed the title, but it was just about like how I was forced to do volunteer work and I ended up liking it. So, this essay, I got $100. I thought I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to be rich. But no, my parents were very much, you have to be a doctor. And then when I got to Brown, I flunked out. I didn't flunk out. I could not handle inorganic chemistry, which is one of the first classes you have to take. And my roommate was pre-med, and I just saw her. She just like took off. And I just thought, I can't do this. So my parents said I have to do something in STEM. And at Brown, econ was the one discipline for which I'd had the fewest course requirements. And so I could take that and I could do an honors thesis. And then I end up, as you can see, really interested in late stage capitalism. So, and then I could work on Wall Street so I could live alone and try to establish.
Did you work at Goldman?
I did, in fact.
I found that fascinating. Just tell us what you did.
I did this purposely so I could live by myself in a situation where it's expensive in New York, and also to fool my parents because they thought that I worked in equity research, for which most of the people would go to Harvard Business School afterwards, and I did not.
But you did the whole thing. You wore the suit and you worked the long hours and worked with all those guys.
6 years.
Yes, I did all of that. The super expensive clothes, the super expensive calculators, people would get fired if you got a decimal point wrong. I had to be at work like at 6:30 if there was call. Like the hours were crazy.
But you were writing at the same time?
I was just
That's
telling
what I couldn't-
Juliana,
how
but that's
did
why I
you
got
do
up at
that?
4:30. I would get up at 4:30 in the morning. I would write for like an hour, half an hour. I'd go running around the reservoir. I'd go to work.
Incredible.
That's what I had to do. That's how I wrote Finding My Voice, basically, is doing
Working
that.
in a bank.
But I'm actually finding, like I love Min Jin Lee's Free Food for Millionaires because I thought she did such a good job explaining what it's like to work at an investment bank. And I'm realizing now a lot of my Columbia students, if they're not Asian American, they're very much like, oh, I can't believe you work for the man. They will actually say that to me, where I'm kind of like, oh, it's interesting like how so many Asian Americans are lawyers. Like Chang Wei Lee also worked at Chase. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, this is how, if you don't have parents who like will buy things for you, like how else are you going to live in New York by yourself and make a lot of money? Like I could not be a waitress like the people on the Girls TV show. That's not how you can live in New York by yourself. So it's kind of funny that was my way of doing it, but I'm seeing that there's so many Asian Americans who are lawyers. When they came to the workshop, like when Monique Trong came to the workshop the first time, she was just like this lawyer going, I think I might want to write.
Okay, wait, go back because this is our next question. Tell us about the Asian American Writers Workshop, which you co-founded in the early 90s while you were still working
I had
where
just
were you?
quit.
Okay.
I just quit and I thought, you know what? I'd made a decision not to get an MFA. I was going to use the opportunity cost of making a lot of money and hopefully having a sustainable career. And then I get out, like I ended up quitting. I got a very small grant from the Society of Children's Book Writers to finish Finding My Voice. And also I had a side business where I did editing for like business school. So I had a income stream.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like quitting my job and I'm all by myself. I have no cohort. I have no idea how to access the literary community. And then luckily my friend Christina said, oh, come meet my friends. And that was it.
So who was in the original group, and tell us a little bit about how you got it started, what your goals were.
First, we were just meeting in this Greek diner. It was me, Christina Chu, Curtis Chen, and Bino Rialuyo. And I think at the time, we were all ex-pre-meds. And we were all just, oh,
Excellent.
Look at my stories. And we all had these problems because I had joined some writers' workshops before. We all had the same experience. Either one, being accused of plagiarism because we're overachievers, or two, being, why don't you write more like Amy Tan? Or why isn't there more rice in your story? Or why does that person call that person aunt when they're not related? And you know what I mean? We're just like, ugh. So, you know what I mean? Like, so suddenly we're at this diner and then just sharing our stuff and it's really cool. And then at one point, a couple more people joined us and then Curtis said, oh, we should do a reading. And I don't know if you guys remember back in New York before the digital, when they had the poetry calendar, it was just a piece of paper with a tiny pharmaceutical font. And that would have all the readings and you would have to go to a bookstore to get it. It was just one page. So we had this tiny, tiny thing that said Asian American Writers Workshop reading at the Chinatown History Museum. 200 people showed up.
Wow.
We almost had to close it because of the fire codes. And then we just realized, wow, there is something here. Mm-hmm. Then we also decided, for other people like us who weren't going to get degrees, well, let's have low-cost writers' workshops. So one of the first ones was Kathy Park Hong, Edlin, Min Jin Lee, Lisa Ko. And then we got this unknown person. We got Jumpo Lahiri to teach it. Right?
That's the craziest
And we're just
group.
These bumbling people.
Do you have photos from this?
I know, I wish.
Yeah.
But it was just the best way to spend my 20s and early 30s.
Another thing I love about your story is that, and it's not that you haven't had a career all these years, but that you did so much writing relatively quietly. And this book is huge, right? This book has taken off. It's going to be on Good Morning America and all these lists, best books of the year type of thing. How does it feel at this point in your life after you've mentored, I guess, so many young writing students, undergraduates and graduate students, to be getting this kind of attention now?
I think a lot of it is when you're writing it, you never know if it's any good. So everyone gets worried, and I'm just really happy to see the reception it's gotten.
Did you have periods where you thought, I'm never going to publish another novel? Did you have those kinds of anxieties?
I mean, 18 years is a long time.
I have friends sending me emails, me going, I'm lost in my novel. I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm going to finish it. Mm-hmm. There were many times like that because it's not just the mechanics of publishing and getting a publisher and then writing it in the way the publisher wants. I think that was one of the, problems is not the right word because I do feel supported. It's hard to get a book published. So I feel very grateful that I'm able to do this. But at the same time, a book is a consumer item. And there are certain ways that people want to sell consumer items, particularly how people want to sell the Asian experience to white people, because they know that white women tend to be the biggest like demographic. So there were certain issues with the book, like, oh, it's readability. Like there was a long time where everyone wanted me to write it chronologically. And we would have these huge fights about it. And it was a lot of me finally just being stubborn enough that they just gave up. But the idea of, or even with Finding My Voice, that one, this very big editor at Bantam Doubleday Dell, and in fact, I saw her at a writer's conference very recently, and it was very funny. So she was just really, you have to write it in third person past tense. First person present is just amateur hour. She actually said it was amateur hour. Like, people don't write like that. And I started rewriting it because I was so desperate. Like, nobody wanted this book. And then again, it felt wrong. And I had a writing mentor who, she didn't tell me what to do. She just said, you have to figure this out for yourself. And I literally figured out, I want people to know what it feels like to be called a name. So it has to be in first person. It has to be present tense. I don't care if this is the wrong voice. So we stuck with it, and it ended up coming out. And with this book too, it came very close to never coming out. But at the same time, all I can do is make something that I am happy with. So readability, voice, I've just learned for myself, it's not going to be worth it for me to make this like the Asian When the Crawdads Sing or whatever. It's just, I can't do it. And yeah, and I constitutionally cannot do it. No matter how much I realize I would want to get published, I cannot do it. And
but do you feel, are you able to enjoy the success and feel validation at all after all these years?
Oh, definitely. And in fact, you know, one like white writer who I esteem very much said the scene of Youngman eating kimchi was one of the best scenes I've ever read in fiction, you know, this whole year. And then I feel really happy because I fought so hard to keep that the way it was.
You got lots of, sounds like not such good advice, or advice that you didn't need to take. You had to be stubborn and believe in what you were doing.
Oh,
I'm sure
definitely.
that's tough.
And it was similar to when we were founding the writers workshop, Amy Tan was so hegemonic. So that was like, everything was in relation. Is your book like Amy Tan's? Is it not like Amy Tan's? You know what I mean? It was not Amy Tan's fault, but it became this kind of lyrical, like exotified, your grandma's story. Like that became like this template for how Asian American literature is written.
You've written a lot of editorial articles about, you know, your political views, but also you've really pioneered the use of cannabis to treat autism due to the experimentations that you went through with your son. And it was a real medical breakthrough. You went against convention to find your own way. Can you share what that experience was like? And I think your son is the first, is it minor to have a medical
we were the first people
in
to
the
use
country?
it. Yes, we were the first person to think to use it in pediatric use and for autism.
We should explain that. So, Marie, you wrote a piece in the Washington Post that went totally viral. The headline is, I made my son cannabis cookies. They changed his life, right?
Yes.
What year was that, 2018?
That was 2018. And actually before that, when he was 9 and we first started, I wrote a whole series for Slate on, they called it, my kid is autism, I give him pot, or some clickbaity thing like that.
Right.
Yeah, so that was the first one.
So this is what I was referring to in our intro about how you're known for this work that you've done and being very outspoken about the outdated laws and the regulations and how the medical community isn't supportive of this use of cannabis.
I mean, you really spearheaded that. I mean, you were testing, you were working with growers, you were testing on yourself before you would give anything to your son, because there wasn't this kind of, I mean, I guess it's very controversial with pediatrics. And so you pushed for this to happen really much sooner than it ever would have.
I think there's a certain amount of desperation and feeling like there were no good options. And what's interesting is the one like antipsychotic drug that they wanted to put him on, that the company has been sued and paid $2 billion in fines for the side effects that have been deadly. And then just the weird coming to cannabis, mainly because it was the only thing that wouldn't kill him if I messed it up. That was the main thing, but it ended up, after years worth of experimentation, it ended up really helping him, where we understand that it's neurodegenerative. And then now, in conjunction with some other therapies, like how strange that after 20 years of people think he's completely unreachable, he's mentally retarded, that he speaks.
Huge. Yeah.
Right.
So
that
explain this more clearly, that only in the past few months?
It's really only been in the, and I don't know if you
And what exactly did you see, or what was the change?
I actually got this idea from a friend of mine who's a palliative care physician. He said when people have strokes, they often will continue to have aphasia where they cannot speak because speaking is actually very complicated, but they can still point. So we have these boards that are just the alphabet, and it's nothing special. People think we had some electronic device. No, we just have a board with an alphabet, and we've been trying to teach him how to point to this board. And there are people who do similar therapies. We just take him all over the place to try to do these therapies, but like nothing's happened. Like this one time we took him to Texas to this woman who is kind of a founder. She was able to get her son to be able to point. And then at one point when she asked Jason, they were doing a lesson on geography, is there a place he'd like to visit? And he managed to point out the Grand Canyon, which surprised us because we didn't know he knew how to use articles. But after that one little blip, the rest of the week was just crap. And he also like put his head through her wall. And we just thought, oh, this is just not working. But we've kept on with it. But we've also like broken with her protocol. Like you're not supposed to touch them. And then, so one day I was trying to like, I feel like my son doesn't, his like arm, when you just let him go, it just goes all over the place. So I started like holding his hand and then letting him do it, but by giving him pressure. So he has like feedback. And I asked him, because he's had a better day when he had this therapy. And I said, why are you being less violent today? And he did manage to hold it together enough to go HOPE. Yeah. And I told my husband, that was kind of like our Anne Sullivan, like Helen Keller moment. I said, this can't be some kind of coincidence. He managed to do this. And then, so there's just been weeks of, it's just been all weird. But then my husband is much stronger. And it also turned out, so my son can be very violent. And in order to do this, we have to show him the board, and he can get very violent. And a lot of it, he was saying it was hard for him because he was really afraid of hurting me. But when my husband did it, he didn't feel as bad, I guess, about hitting him and stuff. And so my husband did it. Also, my husband's much stronger. If he's going to like try to poke you or something, then he just one day, when we're just asking him a question, he actually spelled out like, hold the board up better so I can see. So that's the first time we noticed that's his voice coming out. The other thing that's really cute is that the other day he typed out like he was having a tantrum when we were trying to have a conversation with my family. And he just said, I don't like being made to do tricks. And oddly, he's almost like neurotypical inside. And this is what's been strange, but he just said he just listened. He's just been listening to us.
And he has opinions about politics. He knows the news.
He knows what critical race theory is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So
did I hear you mention that you are helping him tell his story or write some kind of book?
Because he's also finding that he types better with me. He tends to get less. So when he starts getting agitated, he will get violent. But he's finding he can stay calmer with me and be less worried about hurting me if we type. And what's really interesting is he has already typed a lot of his book because he said he's just been sitting with himself and like writing it this whole time. So it's coming out fairly quickly. I said, okay, do you know who Solzhenitsyn is? And he goes, yes, Russian dissident writer. He was on the Gulag for a very long time. So I was able to tell him the story that when Solzhenitsyn was on the Gulag, in order for him to write his book, he would take little pieces of bread and chew it up and make these little like rosaries as mnemonics. So then when he got out, his books are so long that he could just write his book. So Jason is similar, where he's just written it, and he has an amazing memory, which must be helping him sort of organize his world the whole time when we didn't know what was going on. And so I think this book is going to do a lot also to show that, no, he's wanted to be with people all this time. And he had to teach himself how to read. And even, it turned out one of the things he said is he wanted to go on my book tour. So instead of going to camp, we went to Boston. And the night before, we just took out the board and said, is there anything else you want to say? And he just said, what time are we leaving? And, for the last 20 years, they've told us because he has autism, he does not understand WH questions, who, what, where, why. And so these whole paradigms, it's more like, no, it's an output thing. It's not an input. But there's never been a moment where I really truly felt like the people who work with him, and probably me to some degree, think he's in there to that degree.
Can you just tell us a little bit about your next book? It sounds like you're already writing it in the middle of it.
Yeah, so that one is this other project, a memoir that I'm doing about my father. I have put aside because we're going to do this with Jason. And so, but then I do have the young adult novel, that's a retelling of Mice and Men. And it is from a non-neurotypical perspective, but I'm also realizing, I didn't realize it's also about gun culture and about the fact that people who have disabilities, especially if they're mental disabilities, people are afraid of them, but they actually have a much more chance of being shot, particularly by police. I'm done writing that. So I think creatively, I'm going to be more working on stuff with Jason right now. I thought I was done with young adult stuff. I thought I was like so out of that culture, but I'm realizing that maybe not.
Thank you so much for this fantastic conversation and having us in your home.
Thank you so much. This is such a great conversation.
Thanks, Marie.
Yay.
Thank you for listening to K-Pod, a production of Korean American Story. Our audio and visual engineer is AJ Valente. Our executive producer is HJ Lee. Our videographer is Kimberly Young Sun. Our production assistant is Deborah Peck. You can follow K-Pod on Instagram at Korean American Story. You can follow Marie at Marie Myung-Ok Lee. You can follow Juliana at Juliana_Sohn. And you can follow Catherine at Catherine Hong 100.